Teach your children in the classroom. English, history. What do they teach about the Indians? Took us prisoner in your fight to be free. Little white lies, little white lies, little white lies, little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies.
Diego, it is February 5th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for sovereignty and autonomy. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus Territory, the Seneca Nation, and simulcast and rebroadcast on the Gwe. That's CKWE in Tandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com. And, of course, we are streaming live on Facebook Live. This show will also get posted up not only on Facebook, but on YouTube and on SoundCloud for listening after our broadcast. I am John Kane. I am the show's host and producer, and our studio engineer is Kelly McMillan. I want to give her props for our setup. Look, we opened up with Little White Lies. Let me first say, not all lies are spoken. You know, let that one settle in a little bit. You know, sometimes it's the silence that that can be dishonest. So I'll leave that out and that out there, and leave that as a reference to the music we opened with. I'm not going to talk about football, Super Bowl, celebration riots, even the racial components associated with white people rioting in celebration versus people of color rioting in protest. But I'm not even going to get into that. I'm not going to do any Trump watch. not going to get into any of that. What I do want to talk about is our voice. There, as you may be aware of, the issue relating to the Seneca Nation's revenue sharing has become awfully quiet. And, you know, that silence and that quietness can lead people to believe that the battle's over, you know, that it's the point is moot somehow. This is where the two words moot and mute sometimes can be confused. But I want to revisit some of the history associated with the Seneca Nation's battles with the state over gaming. And part of the reason I want to do that is because, you know, there are voices that get heard by decision makers. And I'm not just talking about the Seneca Nation. I mean it all governing governments, levels of government. And I have to say right out of the gate here, I am I would consider myself more of a follower or believer in the Guyana de Goa, which is traditional governance. Now, having said that, I say with much sadness that I don't see any territories operating anywhere with what I would consider true traditional or native governance. We have been blindsided and inundated with the influences of state government, federal government, outside forces, church, all kinds of stuff. And most native territories, even the ones who claim to be traditional, are anything but. I mean, they really are anything but. We see levels of corruption and collusion, if you will, even in places like Onondaga and others, that will very easily slip in bed with state police when it's convenient for them, or into a state court or a federal court. So as much as I'm a fan or a supporter of traditional government, I am frustrated that I don't see it anywhere. Now, where does this leave me with non-traditional governance? Well, I would say the same thing. While I'm not a fan of elected systems of governance, because I think elections are like beauty contests and popularity contests, and they don't serve to provide what I think is adequate governance. And I find most elected governments, band councils, elected councils, tribal councils, to be rife with corruption there too. But having said that, there are ways of mitigating the problems that exist with any governing structure, and first and foremost, it's transparency. And I don't mean just them showing the so-called governance or leaders or whoever you want to call these representatives being transparent with you, but you being forthright with them. Our voices need to be heard, so we have to be engaged. So, and again, that whether that's within a clan system, of traditional governance, or whether it's in an elected system, once somebody gets put into a position, whether it's done through, a condolence or whether it's done through an election, that doesn't mean they have free reign. They haven't been empowered. That means that they are now servants of the people. And if you aren't barking out some orders for them, then they're going to do what they feel is right. Sometimes with good intentions, and sometimes not with good intentions. So I want to revisit some history, because here's kind of, I guess first off, here's kind of where we're at with the current battle with the state over revenue sharing, because it is deafeningly silence. I mean, nobody's talking about this, and so I feel like, why am I the only one talking about it? Well, I'll tell you why, and that'll get kind of laid out in some of the history. But just because we're not hearing things in the press doesn't mean that there's not conversations happening. And again, I'm not a fan of the lawyers and the lobbyists and the consultants having more of a voice in native governance than the native people. But oftentimes that's the case. So to all you Senecas who perhaps a year ago were really on your game, and you were telling your elected counselors, how you felt about sharing revenue with the state, and really expressing your demands, if not your opinions, you're not doing that anymore. But you know what? There are people the Seneca Nation pays, and I mean pays handsomely, that are still putting bugs in their ear. And you know what? They may say, "Oh yeah, we represent the Seneca Nation as because we're consultants or we're lobbyists for them." But I'll go back, and as I revisit some of the history, I'm going to demonstrate how there's a big question on who those people really represent. When a non-native lobbying firm or consultant is hired by the Seneca Nation, what is their function? Because what we're always told is that they allow or they provide access to state and federal government. You got to pay for that? You got to pay for that access? Well, and my question ends up being, are they providing access to the governor or to the president, or are they providing the state and federal government access to the Seneca Nation? Because that's there's a problem if it's the latter rather than the former. I'm not real happy about the former either, but these are some of the questions that have to be raised. So right now, the status of the fight with the state of New York, and again, as updated as this is my update based on what I know. The state has named their judge in the arbitration, what will ultimately, or supposed to be ultimately be the arbitration. They have named their candidate for one of the judges. The Seneca Nation has named theirs. Now, this is supposed to be a 3-judge system, so there's still a 3rd judge that has to be selected, which hasn't been done yet. Now, by the language of the compact, it suggests that the 2 judges that have been selected by each party, those 2 judges will select the 3rd. But what I understand is the state is saying, no, we want to have more of a hand in that 3rd judge, and so the Seneca Nation countered with kind of the same thing. So now, rather than the judges picking the third judge, you've got another impasse between the state of New York and the Seneca Nation. Now, I heard one of the solutions that was being thrown out was, why don't we rely on a neutral party, the American Arbitration Association? Well, again, Senecas, you can have your own opinion on this thing, but my opinion is, the American arbitration system, that might be what's being used here, but that doesn't mean that it's a neutral playing field. It's still one of theirs. It's not our system. It's still one of their systems. It may not be state court or federal court, and maybe an arbitration hearing, but it's still not one of our systems. So if you're going to let that system select the third judge in a tribunal, how much are you allowing the deck to be stacked against you? That's my concern. But anyway, so that's where it's at. I don't think they've come up with a solution to who is going to be a third judge or how that third judge is actually going to be selected. But if I'm Seneca, I might want to ask that question and then weigh in with my personal opinion. Now, how much your elected leaders, your elected counselors, your representatives, the servants that you have elected, how much they really serve you, I guess you'll find that out by the response that you get. So that's where it's at. Now, this has dragged on for quite some time. I mean, for the municipalities who were crying such dire poverty, Niagara Falls in particular, but the city of Salamanca as well, and even as of late, I think the last real story on this really came from Buffalo, because they had blown through all of their contingency funds, I guess, for emergencies. They've blown through it all, and by some estimations, they were going to be broke, within the next month or so. And of course, they were citing, the loss, or what they were saying was the loss of $6 million worth of gaming funds, what they claimed were tied up in arbitration, $6 or $7 million, and another $6 or $7 million worth of what they were projecting as sales tax revenue for property sales in Buffalo. So they cited those two, $12 to $14 million, losses, which they're characterizing as losses, as part of the reason that they're finding themselves in dire straits. But again, for all of that noise, there doesn't seem to be, the state isn't rushing to have this thing resolved, which begs the question of, what is the strategy? Well, before I offer my thoughts on that, let's kind of visit the past. So when the Seneca Nation negotiated the compact, they and I'm going to plow some old dirt here. They entered into this revenue sharing agreement, and that revenue sharing agreement suggested that they would be the state would concede to the Seneca Nation an exclusivity zone where the Seneca Nation could operate gaming free of competition. That's the spirit of the agreement, right? Free of competition. And that exclusivity zone would be, I think, 15 counties. It would stretch all the way to the other side of Rochester and, of course, all of Western New York. And for that, the Seneca Nation would provide a stream of revenue sharing to the state, and 25% of that would come back to the municipalities that surround the gaming. So 25% of the gaming revenue that went to the state from Niagara Falls would go back to Niagara Falls, the city of Niagara Falls. From the casino in Niagara Falls would come back to the city of Niagara Falls. 25% of the gaming revenue from Buffalo Creek Casino would that would go to the state, would come back to the city of Buffalo, and of course, 25% of the gaming revenue going to the state from the Seneca Allegheny Casino would come back to Salamanca. Now, the amount that was going to the state was a sliding scale that started out 18% for years 1 through 4, then went up to 22% for years 5 through 7, and then from years 8 through 14, it was 25%. Now, that was 25% of the net slot drop. I know I've said this stuff before, but I've got to revisit it all. So that net slot drop is the total amount of money that goes into the slot machine minus the payout. 25% of that would go to the state. Now, the 75% that remained with the Seneca Nation, the Seneca Nation had to cover all of the expenses associated with that revenue, the machines, the licenses, the leases, the financing, the building surrounding it, the electricity, the staffing, the slot attendants, the cocktail waitresses, everything else would come out of the 75%. The state got that money just free and clear. 25% just went straight to the state. So really that 25% probably represented close to 50% of the slot revenue if you factor in how much the Seneca Nation had to, pay out of their 75%. But regardless, so that it ends up being 25%. Well, the state, in their wordsmithing of the compact, tried to create ways that they could breach the compact and still have the compact be, or the revenue sharing provision of the compact, and still have the revenue sharing somewhat intact. In fact, they created a scenario where they could breach, where they claimed they could operate games that would compete against the Seneca Nation slot machines. But if they were considered a different class of machine, that they would still have to get paid from the Class 3 slots. It's confusing and it's convoluted, but regardless, in the original compact, the state had language that paved the way for them to still compete against the Seneca Nation in this exclusivity zone. Which, even if you say, okay, well, if it was in the deal, it's in the deal. Well, we'll address that a little bit, because it goes to the question of, well, what was the value of the exclusivity arrangement in the first place? I mean, what was the value of it if the state really could still compete against them? Because in order for revenue sharing to occur and be legal within the federal statute, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, the state had to concede something that was both substantial and quantifiable. By substantial, it means it had to be somewhat equitable to, or equivalent to the amount of money that they were receiving for revenue sharing. And by quantifiable, you should be able to calculate what it was worth. So in 2009, the Seneca Nation stopped making the revenue sharing payments to the state. They said, "Look, you're in breach. You created these slot parlors at all these racetracks, and you are definitely carving into our market share. We regard that as a clear breach of the revenue sharing provision of the gaming compact. So we are following the procedures." And what the procedure was, if the Seneca Nation did have an allegation of a breach of contract, then, at least on this revenue sharing provision, then what they would do is no longer make the payments to the state, but rather escrow that money, put that money into an account, so it would be set aside until they could resolve the conflict. And then whatever that resolution involved, they would figure out how the money would be disposed of, so to speak. So in 2009, the Seneca Nation stopped making payments to the state and began escrowing those revenue sharing payments. Now, I will say, again, the municipalities felt the crunch almost immediately. And the Seneca Nation offered to continue paying the municipalities right from the start. They said, "Look, we can keep paying you." Well, essentially, we've got all the calculations. We know what you would be getting if we were making these payments. We can make those payments to you, but we need to have an assurance from the state that, however we resolve this thing, that we are credited the dollars that we pay to you as to the municipalities. And the state said, no, we're not going to let you do that. So the state refused to negotiate any terms for the Seneca Nation to pay the municipalities. Now, even though the Seneca Nation put that out there, guys like Paul Deister from Niagara Falls, they still railed against the Seneca Nation. I mean, this guy made all kinds of, threats, and including the threat to refuse to let the fire department go to Seneca Niagara Casino if there was a fire. I mean, just really outrageous things that this guy was saying all the time. So that was the status. Now, Robert Porter was the president through some of this, and it was clear that he wanted to make a deal. I mean, he thought that he could be a hero if he negotiated a settlement with the state. The problem is that he and Andrew Cuomo did not get along. And in fact, Andrew Cuomo couldn't stand Robert Porter. So when Barry Snyder gets in, that relation between Barry Snyder and Andrew Cuomo was not nearly as volatile as what Robert Porter's relationship was with him. So there was already a different dynamic there. Now, arbitration had begun. They had the three judges, seated, and arbitration was well underway. But by the time 2013 comes along, and now the state is looking at trying to push through a public referendum so they can do Class 3 gaming of their own, not just the racino stuff that they were already engaged in that was taking some market share away from the Seneca Nation, but now they want to go to full bore Class 3 casinos. And the referendum would have them approving 4 casinos, one of them right on the fringe, right on the edge, just outside the state, the Seneca Nation's exclusivity zone, but clearly one that would have impact on the Seneca Nation market. And then another one down, or a couple of them down in the southern tier, one out near Binghamton and one into the Catskills. And one in the Catskills, by the way, which is opening up, actually it may be opened up now, at least at some level. And that ultimately is going to be a $1.5 billion facility, bigger than any facility in the whole state of New York. But so in 2013, that's what is on the plate in front of Andrew Cuomo. So he decides that he needs to put a lot of pressure to try to get not only the Seneca Nation to make a deal outside of the arbitration settlement, but also to resolve a conflict that he was having with the folks up in Akwesasne at the time over revenue sharing, and try to squeeze the Oneidas to enter into a revenue sharing agreement, even though they had, again, one of those racetrack slot parlors, one of those racetrack casinos, only 3 miles away from Turning Stone Casino. So, and he did. He put pressure on and resolved it with the Oneidas. Got 25% out of them, and then worked out some sort of settlement with the folks up in Akwesasne, or St. Regis, I should say. So there was the Seneca Nation, who was in a very, very strong position because it was clear that the state had breached certainly the spirit of the compact. And even if they hadn't breached the actual language, because they had provisions that somehow entitled them to do electronic gaming, what they were calling lotteries, essentially, their ability to transform what a lottery was into what they were calling VLTs, video lottery terminals, which essentially were slot machines, all of a sudden diminished significantly what would have been the value of that exclusivity agreement in the first place. So there was a lot of problems that the state would be facing, even if they could win the argument by the letter of or the language of the compact. The overarching question that that would have been dealt with at arbitration was, what was this? Was the state providing something of significant value to the Seneca Nation, and could they quantify that it was worth what they were trying to impose on the Seneca Nation, this 25% of the net slot drop? But the state put enough pressure, and I'll tell you, the bugs that were in the ears of the Seneca leadership at the time, guys like Steve Pigeon, these lawyers and lobbyists, these lawyers who represent gaming interests throughout the country. They call themselves, Indian gaming experts. That's their area of expertise, which means they homogenize all native territories so they don't, have anybody stand out any farther than anybody else, regardless of our circumstance. So they were all advising that the Seneca Nation make a deal. And so Barry Snyder did. He made a deal, bailed on arbitration, cut a check to the state of New York for $400 million. That escrow had built up from 2009 to 2013. It had built up to $600 million. So the Seneca Nation dealt. They said, no, we'll keep 200, but we'll cut you the check for 400. Now, everybody treated it as, oh yeah, we won $200 million. No, you paid $400 million. And even if you consider that to have been some win, that you got to keep a third of the escrow money, you didn't reduce the percentage down to a third. You were still going to pay 25% through the remainder of the term, which was to 2016. But again, I don't know what the disposition of the Seneca people were at the time. But clearly the Senecas had a solid argument against the state. And ultimately, they made a deal, and they paid $400 million for that deal. And then promised they would keep making timely payments after that. And the only concession that the state made, other than paying the losing the $200 million, which was clearly a surrender for the breach that they had committed, was that they were no longer going to call the racetrack casinos in the exclusivity zone casinos. They would call them racinos from there on out. And they would no longer call them slot machines. They would call them electronic games. So other than changing some language in what they were operating, they didn't change anything about the way they were operating. And they would continue to compete directly against the Seneca Nation's gaming facilities while the Seneca Nation was paying them 25% of their net slot drop. Now, all 16 counselors of the Seneca Nation stood behind Barry Snyder on this thing, and they agreed with him. And I know that I personally had some conversations with a few of them, and almost to a person on that council, I heard the same thing said, either directly or indirectly. They said, well, we needed to make a deal because if we didn't, the state might not renew the compact in 2016. So what they're actually saying is we had to pay them so they would renew the compact in 2016. And I even had that conversation with one of the guys that the Seneca Nation has hired from time to time, the Steve Pigeon. Steve Pigeon, the guy who's mired in corruption charges and allegations at the state level. I think he actually may have pled guilty to some of those corruption charges. Well, he was a prominent voice in this debate. I was on television with him on Channel 2. We had a debate, and he was singing the praises about how great a deal this would be with the Seneca Nation paying off the state. And but he also at that time, and I gotta say this because what the state was threatening at the time was that if the Senecas don't pay, they were going to authorize a casino to be built in Niagara Falls. Now, I've said this back then, and I've said it more recently. There's no way in hell somebody was going to build a casino in Niagara Falls under a state license, because if they were going to compete against the Seneca Nation paying nothing, if that was the point, that the Senecas wouldn't pay while a state casino would be built there, nobody was going to invest $500 million to build a facility where they're going to pay somewhere between 40 to 50% of their revenue stream to the state of New York and compete straight up against a gaming facility that's already been operating for over 10 years that pays nothing. It just wasn't going to happen. But Steve Pigeon went on television saying, oh, no, the market is great. I mean, there's plenty of room for competition. The competition will expand the gaming market. He insisted on television, and this is back in 2013, that if the state built casinos in Niagara Falls, that it would be a good thing for the Seneca Nation. Of course, what's proven out more recently is that the gaming facilities that the state has opened up with their Class 3 referendum approval, one in the southern tier down near Binghamton, one on the other side of Rochester, and one out near Albany and Schenectady. Those three gaming facilities are actually failing miserably. Del Lago, the one along the thruway near Rochester, isn't even making enough money to cover its debt service. So that's how bad that calculation has been. So not only does the market not bear enough, to not infringe upon the Seneca Nation's market share, it's not big enough to even carry what their projections were for the state licensed casinos. So that's one of the guys who had a bug in the leadership of the Seneca Nation's ear at the time, Steve Pigeon. Not the only one, but he was among them. So this is kind of where things were in 2013. The council basically stood behind Barry Snyder and said, look, we're going to pay the $400 million and then pay 25%, through the rest of this compact because we need to make sure the state approves the gaming compact, renews the gaming compact in 2016. That's what happened in 2013. Look, we're at the bottom of the hour. Let me take a break here. When I come back, I'll bring it fast forward to where we're at now and why the Seneca people need to be concerned and need to be heard about their concerns or not. I mean, that's a choice that the Senecas will have to make. But I'll talk about it when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native.
Sun comes up on another day. Same faces smiling my same way. I know she feels the same way too. Damn, it's just you. Well, maybe I'm not the romantic kind. No candlelight dinners and no fine French wine. I love you, baby, but I forget to say. I know it's wrong, but I'm just that way. Feel the light, feel the light. There's something going on. Feel the light, and it feel like we got trouble in the way. I'm here to tell you it wasn't always this way. You used to call me baby 10 times a day, and now the only call I ever get from you is from the bar. Half past 2. Feel the light, feel the light.
All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Look, I want to thank my sponsors that allow me and provide me the opportunity to do what I do. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and some of my good friends who make contributions out of their own pockets, guys like Ed Schindler and Cynthia Trice, Neville Spring, Sugar Montour. I want to thank all of you who have supported what I do here. Not only what I do here, but your support allows me to make the trip to New York to do the show I do in New York each week. So without you, I couldn't do it, and I appreciate all of you who have not just supported now, but who've supported in the past, and that includes a long list of others, including the Seneca Nation, who have supported the work that I do. So I want to thank you all for allowing me to continue to educate, entertain, and inform for over 7 years now that we're into our 8th year. Again, I want to thank you for joining the fight and doing your part. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. I want to thank CKWE, the Guay in Tandanega for the simulcast and the rebroadcasts. I also want to thank Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. And, of course, I want to thank all of you who share the show, whether you share it as my wife does, the Facebook live stream, sharing it on various group pages, whether you're sharing the SoundCloud audio that I post up after the show, or our YouTube channel, our YouTube videos. We do have a channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. We post the video of this show on that YouTube channel, and then we create some of our own videos, and we're going to do a couple more coming up here soon. Shortly, possibly next week, we're going to do a video on racism again. Something I think to put it in that conversation in its proper perspective. So I want to mention that. Look, I also want to mention on February 14th, we are into February. So on February 14th, I know most of you are saying, "Well, isn't that Valentine's Day?" Yeah, I guess it is, but it's also a day that we are trying to raise awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women. If you see the banner behind me, I don't know if we can zoom out a little bit. This is a design that I put to try to raise attention to the plight of missing and murdered Indigenous women. But on February 14th, we will be looking at and talking about some of the vigils that are taking place throughout many of the territories and well, in cities across Turtle Island, both on the U.S. and the Canadian side of the imaginary line. And also, I'm promoting, I guess, what can only be called the Red Dress Campaign. And that's folks taking pictures of red dresses and posting them on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, YouTube. I mean, they can be still shots or they can be videos or montages, whatever, slideshows, whatever you want to call it. The empty red dress has come to symbolize the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And the idea of taking pictures of these red dresses in what may be provocative places, like in front of a courthouse or in front of a police station or on the banks of a river, for instance, where we've had some of our women wash up from after being murdered or after having been missing for a length of time. Railroad tracks, highways, and we have women who turn up missing, along the Highway of Tears and other places. Rural areas like our native territories themselves. Playgrounds. Murdered and missing Indigenous women are not just older women; they are our young women, our girls, our children. So the Red Dress Campaign is also something that I'm advocating people post up on February 14th. Post up pictures that may be both provocative or thought-provoking anyway, but certainly to send a message that you are in the fight to raise awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I hope you'll do that on February 14th. All right, before we went to break, I pretty much laid out that in 2013, the Seneca Nation, mired in a battle over revenue sharing with the state back then, made a deal with the state. They abandoned arbitration, and they cut a deal. And they cut a deal that had them paying the state $400 million out of the escrow funds that they had been setting the revenue sharing payments aside. They kept $200 million, and I don't want to downplay that, but so essentially a third of the escrow money they kept, but they still cut a check for $400 million. Big check, actually, literally, it was a big check. And they had plenty of photo ops with the mayors of Niagara Falls and Salamanca and Buffalo, and the governor came out for the photo ops, and it was quite a spectacle. And even though they kept a third of the escrow money, they didn't reduce the payments, the percentage going forward. So they cut a check for $400 million and then promised they would make timely payments of 25% through the remainder of the through the rest of the compact. And again, the entire council, all 16, and there were some divisions in that council back then. So, I mean, don't anybody think that this is just the Seneca party necessarily either. This was, it had come out of a fairly divisive administration prior to the Snyder administration. But all 16 councilors lined up with Barry on this, and they supported making this deal. And they were clear that the reason they supported it is because they were afraid that the state would not renew the compact in 2016. So my question is, are you still scared? I mean, are these 16 councilors scared? Is this president scared? I don't know. I mean, and I'm not saying that they are, but it's awfully quiet right now. And again, as I said before, there were a lot of voices that were coming, that were being heard by the Seneca Nation, not necessarily from Senecas back in 2013, that convinced them. Some of those voices, many of those voices came from Albany, some of them from Washington. So, I mean, keep in mind, there was a Democrat in the governor's mansion and a Democrat in the White House back then. And, so there was a lot of pressure for the Seneca Nation to come off that money that they were escrowing. And they did. So, I mean, they had a solid argument. I mean, honestly, this thing could have gone through arbitration and ended the revenue sharing in its tracks right then. I mean, in 2013, this thing could have been done. Now, I know there are people that are going to say, "Oh, yeah, but we could have lost too, and then we wouldn't have kept that $200 million." That likely was not going to happen. That really was not likely to happen. And if it was, I mean, if you were that concerned then, then where are you at now? Because I think the argument the Seneca Nation is making since the compact renewal, which is clear when you look at the language of the compact, that it was only termed for 14 years, revenue sharing. But you know what? If that fear back in 2013 was not but whether you were right or wrong, but whether you would have a governor that would somehow void out or not renew a compact, is that fear still there? Is there a buzz that is being, heard by these elected officials of the Seneca Nation that says, make a deal? And if so, then how do you make that buzz diminish? Well, I'll tell you how you make the buzz diminish. Let your voices be heard. Look, if you're Seneca and you think it's wrong for the Seneca Nation to continue to pay the state revenue sharing, look, I don't care if you made noise a year ago. You should be making noise now, because the silence that goes on is not the silence you think it is. Because there are still voices. There are still voices echoing around the Seneca administration buildings. And there are still voices coming from Albany. And your silence may be interpreted as approval to make a deal. So the question is, are you going to make some noise? And maybe you're okay with it. Maybe the average Seneca says, you know what, we should pay the state something. And if that's your view, I respect that view. I know my opinion is, and I'm not Seneca, so I don't really have a dog in this fight. My opinion is, no, you shouldn't be paying the state of New York. And not only is it my opinion that you shouldn't be paying the state of New York, my opinion is that market share is shrinking. So if you don't hang on to that 25%, Senecas, you might be losing some programs and services from the Seneca Nation, because that money is not growing. That money that comes in from Seneca Gaming is not getting bigger each year. It's getting smaller each year. The only way that money is going to get bigger, or the only growth that the Seneca Nation has seen in revenue, came last year when they stopped paying 25%. And what does 25% mean? 25% is somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 to $200 million a year, somewhere in that neighborhood. I mean, at its peak, 25% of the slot drop was close to $200 million a year at one time. It's probably closer to $120 million a year now. Why? Because the market's been saturated by the state of New York. They've opened up 3 Class 3 gaming facilities to go along with their 6 or 8 racinos, and they've got another one coming online, the biggest and boldest yet, coming online now. This is a huge casino with, $1.5 billion casino with extravagant golf course, hotels that are like a suites-only hotel. I mean, every room is a suite. They're building a huge splash park, and it's closer to New York City. So you can make the argument, it's in the Catskills, it's down at Monticello, it's not going to affect our market. Well, Schenectady's worried about it affecting their market. And you know what? Here's the other thing that's crazy about this casino. It's owned by a foreign company. I mean, it's owned by Genting Corporation, which is a Malaysian corporation. In fact, they're the same company that the Seneca Nation borrowed their initial funds to build Seneca Niagara. So this is a Malaysian company opening the biggest casino in the state of New York. So not only is this revenue that is going to be come from the state of New York, but it's actually a lot of it's going to leave New York. It's going to go back to Malaysia. Anyway, that's a whole other issue. So my point in doing this show isn't, I'm not accusing anybody of anything. But what I'm saying, if you're Seneca, and then to take the conversation even beyond being Seneca, if you don't let the folks that you have placed in your service, whether it's a state assemblyman, whether it's a U.S. senator, whether it's a governor or a president, or whether it's a counselor or a treasurer or a Seneca Nation president or a tribal counselor or a chief or a sub-chief or a clan mother, whatever you claim as your governing structure. If you aren't heard by them, then you're simply not heard. They aren't representing you if you aren't giving them something to represent. So the reason I wanted to do this show is because It has been so quiet. And look, Seneca people, the choice is yours. I mean, it should be your choice. It shouldn't be the choice of your elected officials. It should be up to you what happens here. I mean, and like I said, I'm not Seneca. I don't have a dog in this fight. But I feel it's my responsibility to at least, just as I have informed the general public about how wrong the state was in this position in 2013 and how wrong they are now, I just think that people have to be aware of what the circumstances are. And if you are at all concerned about the Seneca Nation making a deal here, then you probably should be heard. And if you're okay with it, then that's fine. You know, if you're okay with making a deal with the state of New York, you still should probably be heard. You let your elected officials, let your counselors know. Yeah, I fully support. Go ahead and make a deal. I would be surprised if that's your view, but you know what? I would support that view if that's your view. Maybe in somebody's infinite wisdom, the idea of sending $100 million to the state each year is money well spent. It might be money well spent, to the as far as the state's concerned, and certainly Niagara Falls and Buffalo and Salamanca. But know that $100 million a year, $120 million is what the state had budgeted, coming in from Seneca Gaming. That's $120 million that isn't going into the Seneca Nation, that isn't going into Western New York. Even if 25% of that comes back to Western New York, most of it's leaving. $1 billion has left Western New York. $1 billion, $1.5 billion has left the Seneca Nation through this revenue sharing in the past. And going forward, it'll continue to be 100, 120, 150. I mean, you can only hope it could be more than that, but the likelihood is it's it'll probably get dropped down to about $100 million a year because of the market share diminishment that the Seneca Nation can hang on to. But you know what? Keeping that $100 million a year, the $120 million a year, that kind of makes up for, at least in the short term, immediately, it kind of makes up for the loss of market share. But if you have to give that up to the state, then obviously the Seneca Nation won't have the revenue that it would have otherwise. So I'm not threatening, with diminishment in the annuities. I know that's probably one of those things that, anybody running for office would never want to suggest. But I'll tell you, with a diminishing market share and still paying the state, programs are going to have to get cut, if not annuities. Of course, and here's the other thing, obviously. The other obvious question is there a deal to be had? Does it make sense to go to the state and say, okay, we're not going to pay you 25%, but we'll pay you 15 or 10? I mean, maybe that's what some of the logic is. Well, in order to keep friendly relations and keep the state happy and keep Niagara Falls happy and Buffalo happy, we'll continue to pay them something, just a lower percentage. I don't know. Maybe that has some appeal to the Seneca people. But if you let that deal happen in darkness, without your voice, then you will only be able to complain about it afterwards, because this won't go to a public referendum. The last one didn't. The last one was a deal made between two people and signed off by 16 counselors. So if you're Seneca and you don't think that you should be paying the state anything, or if you think there's a deal to be had, then tell your elected officials. And so this message that I'm saying, although again, I'm concentrating on the Seneca Nation here because of what's at stake. This same issue we are all dealing with at some level. In every one of our communities, native or non-native, if we don't have our voices heard, then those people who represent us or represent our concerns will make decisions without us. I mean, it really is that simple. So whether you're living in New York City or whether you're living in Buffalo or whether you're living in Tonawanda or, Onondaga or Tuscarora, Look, I'm not saying that the people who are put into these positions, elected or appointed or condoled, whatever, are always the most receptive to our voices. And clearly they aren't. But if you don't let your voice be heard at all, then you're not even giving it a chance. You're not giving yourself a chance to be represented. So the first thing you need to do is be heard. Formulate your opinion. Find out what information you can. Don't just rely on what I'm talking about here on my show. I try to provide the best information I can. But if the past is an indicator of the future, Seneca Nation made a deal in 2013. And it wasn't that good a deal. I mean, in fact, I had a big blow up. I was on WBEN radio the day after the deal was made. Day after the deal was made, I was on. I consider this radio gold. I was invited to be on the morning show on WBN News with Paul Deister. When I got the call, they didn't tell me Paul Deister was going to be there. And when they called Paul, they didn't tell him that I was going to be there. But on my drive into to the studios, and because WBN studio was just down the hall from where my studio was when I was on WWKB. So when I went in, I listened to the radio on the way in, so I knew Paul Deister was coming in. And when I was asked my first question there, and I was asked, who was the big winners and losers here? And I said, the state's the big winner. There's no question the state is the big winner here. Because Niagara Falls, Buffalo, and Salamanca, they were going to get their money. The Seneca Nation had already said long ago that they would make sure that the municipalities were made whole back then on what they would have been the revenue. Their problem was with the state. The state is who breached the compact, not Niagara Falls, not Buffalo, and not Salamanca. So yeah, once that deal was made, all the money freed up, and Buffalo and Niagara Falls and Salamanca got their check. Paul Deister was happier than hell. He had a $60 million check come his way, which he's long since squandered. But I said, but the big losers are the Seneca people, because they cut a check for $400 million even after the breach. And they didn't change the percentage going forward. I said, so the big winner is the state. The state wanted this deal so they could concentrate on getting the referendum passed, which they did. So the state was a big winner. Paul Deister about lost his mind. He started dropping F-bombs and stormed out of the studio. Said that myself and WBN ambushed him. So, look, I've been very candid in my opinions on these battles as they go forward, and whether it's here in Seneca territory or the Onondaga chiefs calling in the state police to beat the hell out of a bunch of people back in 97. I mean, I voice an opinion here, and I try to provide the facts associated with it. And when the Seneca Nation, has done well, I praise them. And when I don't think they have, I'm not saying I condemn them. I guess I do. But I at very least try to expose the facts so people can draw their own opinion. Was it a good deal back in 2013? I personally don't think it was. But if the Seneca people were fine with it, I mean, I also on that show in WBN, I said that I thought the governor and the mayor of Niagara Falls owed the Seneca people an apology. That's part of what Paul Deister lost his mind over. Because when the Senecas wrote that check, among the comments that came from Andrew Cuomo was, well, the Senecas really had a valid point. Funny, he wasn't saying that running up to that deal being made. He never once suggested the Senecas had a valid argument while all the vitriol was being spewed from himself and Paul Deister. But once the check got signed, not the big one, but the real check, once the check got signed, all of a sudden, Andrew Cuomo said, the Senecas, they had a valid point. Yeah, there was, they had a valid complaint. Well, then why don't you apologize for all the crap you said during the run up to this thing for the last couple of years running up to it? So I mean, I know what I voice my opinion, and nobody is compelled to agree with my opinion. But I do say that if you're Seneca and you aren't letting your voice be heard, not mine, but yours, be heard to the people that you elect, the people who are supposed to represent you, all 16 counselors, president and the treasurer, if you aren't letting them know what your opinion is, then you're only going to be able to complain when you find out what deal gets cut, or if a deal gets cut. And the thing is, if you're standing by, if you guys are standing in a unified, in solidarity, taking on the state, even if you lose an arbitration, at least you stood together on the thing. I don't think you're going to lose an arbitration. The only way you can lose an arbitration is if that system is as rigged as the state and federal courts are. And there's a lesson to be learned there. So if you're Seneca, please let your voice be heard, one way or the other. Whether you say, I heard that loudmouth John Kane on the radio, and I think he's wrong. I think you guys should make a deal. Then tell your elected counselors that. But if you're concerned about the Seneca Nation cutting a check for $100 million a year, or 4 checks that'll equal $100 million a year to the state of New York, while your programs are diminished, while you guys are doing whatever you can or taking on more debt to try to expand gaming revenue in an ever-shrinking market, if that's what you're concerned about, then you should be telling your elected officials, no, don't pay the state. Don't pay them 25%, don't pay them 15%, don't pay them 10%, don't pay them anything. And in fact, if Niagara Falls, Buffalo, and Salamanca don't want to come to us and work with us directly, then the hell with them too. I mean, maybe that's your opinion. Kind of my opinion. But again, I'm not Seneca, you are. But this is my message to everybody. My message to everybody is you have to be engaged. You have to be engaged locally first. I mean, anybody who talks about who the governor is or who the president is, the hell with those guys. Deal with the people who are closest to you. Collaborate with the people that you're closest to. Whether that collaboration means it's a march or a protest or a community garden, wherever it is, you got to engage the people closest to you. And some of those people closest to you that you have to engage are the people that you put up to serve you as representatives, as counselors, as assemblymen, school board officials, whatever it is. You need to be heard. I say one of the quotes that I made in the past is the best way to prevent the abuse of authority is to not give it. Your silence gives authority, but your voice takes it back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on Friday. Yahweh.
One night I had a casino dream, and there were voices in my head. I could hear a song from far away, and this is what it said. Now this dream continued haunting me, and I had to tell someone. So I went and told my mother, and she said, "Let me tell you, son. Your great-grandfather was an Indian prince from a tribe called Wannabe. And when I was but a little girl, he would sing this song to me. Hey,